that means anybody under 18, so this refers to most of you guys. Here's my sources of information. Okay, so back in the good old days, they didn't have child labor laws, or they had very few, or they weren't enforced. And so we're going to talk about the good old days. But anyway, make sure that anything that's in red needs to be written down or answered. These are your notes. We're turning these in at the end of the period. Anything in green means you need to get up and do it. Anything else means learn it. All right, let's take a look at this and see what this says. Let's watch this video here. So this is just a super simple thing that shows some pictures. This is just as if it was going on today. Okay, so we don't need to watch the whole thing, but you get the point. So back in the day, before they really enforced the child labor laws, they had little kids working in factories because they would basically work for almost nothing, and the conditions were dangerous. Kids would get hurt or killed or maimed, and they wouldn't go to school. They'd be working like 14 hours a day in unsafe conditions. It was just bad. It was bad news. Okay, so make sure you get out some notes and label the top of your paper labor laws and put your name, and as we go, we'll take some notes. Okay, so I want you to go to this report so you can find this through Canvas. So I want you to click on this thing and write down 15 things that can get an employer in trouble now for breaking labor laws, and specifically child labor laws. So open this thing up, and specifically here's how I'd work. I'd go down to the bottom, and it shows things that employers can get in trouble for. Okay, so I'd say basically they can get in trouble for not paying the wages that people are deserving, not putting things on the pay stub that needs to be there, not providing a 30-minute meal time, not giving you a break after 4 hours, so on and so forth. So go through here and find kind of all the things that can get an employer in trouble and write it down in your notes. Okay? Okay, so a minor is a person under 18. So here's the deal. If you are a high school graduate, so if let's say you're 17 and you graduate, you have no work or school restrictions, except that you can't do occupations that are against the law. So we're going to talk about that. There's a big group of dangerous occupations that you can't be employed in if you're under 18. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so we're just basically going through the laws for minors. So minors must attend school. You got to go to school in some way. There's different amounts that you have to go. No minor may legally drop out of school entirely. So you can go to like a casino or a alt-ed or sort of thing, but you have to go to some sort of school if you're under 18. Okay, so work permits are required. All minors must have a work permit. There are some exclusions if you're, but they're small. So for the most part, all minors have to have a work permit if you work. Employers, so your boss has to have a permit available for inspection. So if I go and I ask to see the permit, they're supposed to have it ready for me by law. Permits are required even when school is not in session. So during the summertime, you have to have a work permit to work. Minors work with the permission of the local school district. So it's up to Sonora Union High School District if you can work or not. And the school can cancel your work permit at any time for any reason. Permits expire 5 days after the opening of the next school year. So your work permit's going to be good through the summer, and then 5 days into school, and then it's going to be no good, and you're going to have to reapply. Parents must obtain permits for the employment of their minor children in most enterprises. So if your parents have a business, they have to get a work permit for you, unless, here's a small print, unless they're employed in agriculture or domestic labor, and domestic labor is like babysitting and household chores like that. All right. Minors who are, so there's a couple exceptions to the work permit. If you're doing babysitting or yard work, you may not have to have a permit. Okay. But even if you're doing babysitting and yard work and things that don't require a work permit, you're not allowed to do it during school hours. Okay, wages. Minors must be paid at least the minimum wage by state law. So that's $10 an hour. So so this is not for you guys because this is time and a half. If you work over 8 hours, you get time and a half, and if you work over 12 hours in one day, you get double time. But for minors, minors are only allowed to work 8 hours a day. So if your boss is working you 9 hours and giving you overtime, that's illegal because you're not allowed to work over 8 hours. Okay, so this is most of us, ages 16 and 17. Uh, Here's the amount of time you're allowed to work. 4 hours per day on any school day for normal kids. You guys aren't normal kids. 8 hours on non-school days. Okay, and if you're a work experience education student, you can work up to 8 hours a day, but not more than 8 hours. Okay, when school's not in session, everybody can work 8 hours. Anybody 16 or 17 can work 8 hours a day and 48 hours a week. You can't work more than this. Okay, so the spread of hours. So most kids are allowed to work from 5 a.m. up until 10 p.m. So those are anything you can't work before 5 and you can't work after 10. For work experience students, you can, if you get a note, you can work up to 12:30 if you get a note from the school with permission. So if you need to do that, we could probably do that for you. Okay, so I'm not going to go over it, but if your boss works you too much, there are penalties for it. So here's by law you have to have breaks. You have to have a rest period of 10 minutes sometime during each 4 hours of work time. So for every 4 hours of work, you got to have a 10-minute break. And then after 5 hours, you need a 30-minute meal time. Okay, and it's supposed to be accounted for on your time cards, but we're not going to worry about that. But that's by law, you have to have your breaks. All right. So when you're 18, you can work, pretty much do anything, right? So you can be employed in occupations that are hazardous. You don't have to follow the child labor law restrictions as much. So there's a few things you can't do. So you can't work at a bar or a place that basically their whole purpose is to sell alcohol, and you can't transport hazardous materials. So there's a couple things you can't do when you're 18. But for the most part, you can do when you're 18. The laws don't apply to you as much anymore. All right, if you're 16 and 17, you can't. So you can't do most manufacturing jobs. You can't work with most machinery. Here's things you can't do: explosives, radiation, wrecking, logging, power saws, and shears. This is a weird one. The way I read this, you're not allowed to use a circular saw, so you wouldn't be able to work as a carpenter using a circular saw. So I'll have to look that one up. Power-driven, you can't use forklifts and power things that lift things with power. You can't manufacture brick or tile products. All right, so there's a lot of things you can't do. Okay, so you can't do a lot of baking ovens and things like that. Forming, punching, shearing machines, power-driven meat slicing, mining, roofing, demolition of cars and ships and things like that. Demolition of houses, excavation work. So you can't use a backhoe to excavate, and you're not allowed to deliver stuff. Power-driven woodworking machines. So you're not allowed to. You can be in a car and do things in a car, but if delivering is your main thing, you can't do that. All right, we're going to skip the next thing. 1, 2, 3. These are just more detailed. The same thing. All right. Also, if your boss ever sends you to a bar, a saloon, a gambling house, or a house of prostitution, or any other immoral place, that's a misdemeanor. So I don't think that'll ever happen, but it's in the law. Actually, it's a NOR. That might happen. Okay, so here's what your employer has to do. Employer must keep all work permits on file for inspection by school authorities in the state. They have to keep records of every minor employed as well as the time and payroll record. So they have to keep your payroll and stuff there for inspection. They have to have workers' compensation insurance on all their employees. And then they also have to have a written injury and illness prevention program. So by law, all employers have to do this. Okay. They also have to have a bunch of posters up. So there's a whole list. They have to have a minimum wage poster, industrial welfare. Anyway, there's a bunch of posters by law they have to keep up so employees can look at it and know their rights. Okay, so if your parents are your bosses, when parents or guardians employ their minor children, they must meet all the child labor requirements imposed upon other employees. So for the most part, if you work for your parents, the laws are the same. The only parents who are exempt, who don't have to do this, are parents who work in agriculture, horticulture, viticulture, or domestic labor, which is like babysitting and housekeeping. All right, if you want to file a complaint, you can go to this site right here, and that was that same form we looked at earlier. So if your boss is breaking the law and abusing you, you can fill out that report. Okay, so to get the points for this, there's a quiz I have for you in Canvas, and then turn in all the notes you took on this, and that's how you finish it up. All right, but here are some summary charts you can look at. I'm going to go through these quickly so you can take a look at these. This shows the California law and then the federal law. They both apply to us. Usually the California law is stricter than the federal law, but you can look through this at your leisure if you really want to. Okay, there we go, the end.